Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 10th webinar in our volunteer management webinar series. Hard to believe we've done this for 10 months already. Already trying to advance the slides too quickly. My name is Sydney Shutro. I am the Director of Volunteer Services with the Tennessee Commission on Aging and Disability. And welcome to this month's webinar on volunteer risk management, policies and procedures, just in case. So we are going to be talking about some serious materials and some best practices. So again, I'll reiterate this multiple times that while I love volunteer management, I'm getting better at volunteer management. I don't have a degree in it, working on studying for a certification, but I'm not necessarily a volunteer expert yet. I'm trying to do the 10,000 hour rule where you study and practice for 10,000 hours and then you can kind of master whatever it is you're trying to learn. So I'm working on my 10,000 hours. So just kind of letting everyone know that by no means anything we discuss in this webinar is not a requirement to implement. It's not, you're not mandated to implement any of that. So just best practices, and if you want to include anything in your programs, it's best to get with your supervisors, directors, legal team, whatever you need to do to make sure everything is implemented smoothly within your program. So we like to start every month with a recruitment tip of the month. This one may be a little more controversial than the other tips that I've suggested here in the past, but if we can plan it right, a little competition can be friendly and fun when it comes to recruitment. So this was on, I have the article kind of below on a lot of my resources, but this was unusual ways to attract volunteers. So I wanted to give you kind of a more unique recruitment aspect this month. So we might do a friendly competition. Some of us have our competitive streaks. I was an athlete all through high school, so I'm definitely very competitive. It caters to me, may not cater to you or your volunteers, kind of depends. But maybe there's a competition that anyone who is registered as a new volunteer in 2021 can be entered to win some kind of prize. The volunteer who recruits the most new volunteers. So maybe you have a volunteer-a-thon and a volunteer has recruited 10 new volunteers for the program. They may be entered to win something. Or the volunteer that does the most volunteer outreach. Maybe they do some presentations at their local church or Rotary clubs or colleges or something like that, and they can track their outreach to help recruit volunteers for the program. Some of our programs are broken up into regions. So maybe the statewide coordinators have a friendly, again, this is a friendly competition, not hardcore headbutting competition, but maybe implement a friendly competition between the regions and see which region can recruit the most new volunteers for whatever time period you want. It could be a calendar year, it could be whatever grant cycle year you have. So just something to consider. So again, a little bit more unique than traditional. So it may work for some, but not for others. But just an idea to possibly keep in there. And this is one I try to keep the suggestions low cost or free ways to recruit volunteers. This one is a little bit more in terms of what your prizes want to be, could increase on the budget a little bit. So I don't think you should do, a trip to Cancun or anything like that. Like, $25, $50 gift card may be the incentive that's needed to help with this competition. So don't go overboard. And if you can't do it right now, I know things are crazy and, senior centers are opening or considering when to open, and just programs are operating a lot differently. So this may not be something to implement currently, but keep it in your toolbox and maybe you can use it at a later time. So I did this disclaimer last month, and I do want to do the disclaimer this month as well. I'm going to strongly encourage you. We are going to be talking about a lot of policies and procedures. So it is extremely important that you let your legal team, your supervisors, your directors know and consult what you want to do or change. Again, these are serious topics, and I'm not a policy or a legal expert. I can tell you that right now. I consult our legal team a lot on things that I want to do. I can barely put an email together, let alone make a policy sound professional. So any policies, I'm going to do a lot of examples. That was one of the suggestions in the surveys, is that when I say something, do an example of it. So I'm going to have a lot of examples this month. Hopefully I'll take that constructive criticism to heart and hopefully improve on that. So any of the examples have been vetted through the legal team here at the Commission on Aging and Disability. So feel free to copy, adjust, adapt any of the examples that we talk about. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. But again, don't implement anything unless you talk to, or until you talk to, your legal team, your supervisors, your directors, whoever your upper management, maybe it's board of directors, whoever your governing body is. And especially in terms of buy-in, your legal team, supervisors, and everyone in your upper management are extremely vital allies when it comes to the buy-in to your volunteer program. So like I said, we are going to talk about volunteer risk management today. We understand that volunteers, the overwhelming majority, 99.9% of our volunteers, their intentions are good. They want to help our organization and they want to help people in their communities who are struggling. However, there is a very small percentage, like I said, the 0.00001% of people who volunteer for the wrong reasons. This webinar is going to focus on the risk management and how we can make sure we put safeguards in place to prevent as many bad things from happening as possible. Can I guarantee that nothing bad will ever happen in our program? Absolutely not. That's definitely a guarantee that I cannot make. However, we can look at ways that if something does happen, we have policies and procedures in place to make sure that that doesn't happen again, where it's not repeated or doesn't become a trend in our programs. So in short, like it says on the screen, risk management, in my opinion, is really hoping for the best, but we're going to prepare for the worst. So the last thing that we want to see happen in our programs is something like these examples. So charity volunteer steals gifts meant for parents in prison, or kids with parents in prison. We don't want that. A woman stole a purse from a volunteer while she was volunteering. We don't want that to happen. And volunteer treasurer charged with stealing $1 million from charities. We don't want to see these headlines in our program. Some of them are recent headlines. I got 2018, 2019, 2020. I'm sure there are more headlines, but these are just a few of examples of what we want to avoid in our programs, right? I'm hoping everyone's on the same page for that. So what we're going to talk about first is the risk management process. Now, this applies to our volunteers, but it also applies to other aspects of work, personal life, everything. So I try when I do presentations to not only relate it to volunteer management or volunteer engagement, but also things that we can use in other aspects of our life. So here is our risk management process. We're going to identify the risk, we're going to assess the risk, we're going to control the risk, and we're going to review our controls. So going kind of step by step here. The first thing we're going to do is identify that risk. So I'm starting early in this webinar. Some of you may have come up with some fun games, like if you want to stay hydrated, I suggest every time I say volunteer role description, everyone take a drink of water. I say it a lot. Someone probably could do a counter of how many times that I bring this up. But the first thing that we have to do when identifying risk, it's going to relate directly back to our volunteer role description. So there you go, 2 drinks of water. Who's with me? So as you read through your descriptions, so you probably don't want to do this, you have to think of what could go wrong. So every time you say, this is the duty and responsibility, all right, I say someone is responsible for stuffing envelopes. What's the risk of stuffing an envelope? Probably not very much. Paper cut. That's kind of the big one that I can think of. But is there any risk or is there no risk? So let's think of a few examples. So, there was the stuffing envelope example, but let's say for home delivered meals or Meals on Wheels, a volunteer may not deliver a meal. Maybe the person that's receiving the meal may not answer, could be hurt. We had that situation in our upper East Tennessee region. A volunteer could get into an accident on the way to deliver a meal. Maybe with our SHIP and SMP program, the volunteer may give wrong advice that results in a financial penalty to someone that we serve. Or maybe, and this could go for many of our programs that deal with sensitive information, but a volunteer could steal, a social security number or a date of birth or sell information on our clients. So we got to kind of identify those risks as we go through all of our role descriptions. So that's going to be your homework. I like to give everyone a little bit of homework, whether you do it or not. I don't check your homework, don't check your work, don't grade you on your assignments or anything like that. But try and go through your role descriptions and assess or identify any of those risks. So we're going to assess the risk next. It's common practice to rate risk on kind of a scale of 1 to 4. You can really do your own, whatever kind of scale you want, but your scale would be like 1 would be low risk, 2 moderate, 3 would be a high risk, and 4 would be an extreme risk. So maybe you just want to do a 1, 2, 3 system, whatever it is. So low risk, like I said, might be something like stuffing envelopes or mailing your monthly newsletter or answering general questions at the front desk. A moderate risk could be a volunteer working in an atmosphere where something could fall if you're trying to reorganize something or taking maybe heavy items to a health fair, something along those lines. Our high risk could be a volunteer driving a client to the doctor or someone who counts money for a large fundraiser. And an extreme risk could be someone who does something like search and rescue or a volunteer firefighter. So I couldn't really think of any extreme risks that relate to our particular programs, but I'm sure you guys could probably come up with examples for that one. Ultimately, it's going to be up to you, your supervisor, legal team, whoever, to determine which level of risk is a volunteer role would be in, or what those volunteer duties in that volunteer role is going to be. Obviously, the higher the risk, the more safety measures you're going to have in place. And we're all going to discuss a lot of those safety measures here throughout the presentation. So we're going to start polls early today. We just talked about a couple examples. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a poll for everyone. We're going to do a couple of these. I'm going to open up the poll. How do we do that? There we go. So your first poll question is going to show up in your chat box. So if you can all pull up your chat box for me and take a look at this poll. So your question is, how would you rate the risk of a volunteer may not deliver a meal? So are you going to rate that? And it should be open so you guys can start taking that poll. I'm hoping that it's working. There we go. The people are starting. So how would you rate a volunteer not delivering a meal? Low risk, moderate risk, high risk, extreme risk. I'm going to give you guys about 20 more seconds. So please fill that out for me. We got about 8 people who we're waiting on. Come on, get over 50%. Got about 10 seconds left. All right, we'll go ahead and cancel that one. All right, so I don't know if y'all can see the results, but I'm going to tell them to you. I still haven't figured out that component either. Working on a lot of components, trying to figure it out. So we had 9 people respond of the 17 who've logged in. So 4 say a low risk for volunteer not delivering a meal, 2 moderate, and 3 for moderate risk, and 2 for high risk, not delivering a meal. Oh, good. People can see the results. Excellent. I did it right. Yay. So yeah, I would agree. A majority kind of put that in a low to moderate. I would definitely say moderate. And the only reason I say moderate is because there could be a lot of safeguards to put in place to make sure that doesn't happen. And I'm hoping, and we have some meal delivery folks on the webinar, I'm hoping that that's not a huge concern. So I'm going to go ahead and save those results. That way I can update the presentation when I send it out. Let's do at least 1 or 2 more. Let's see what this one is. So how would you rate, open the poll. How would you rate the risk of a volunteer giving wrong advice that results in someone getting a financial penalty? So I opened up that poll. And this could be for, it could be for the SHIP SMP program. Maybe you have volunteers that come in to do taxes or, legal counseling of some kind. So try not to put it in the box of just one particular program. Try and frame it in the program that you are working for, if this could be a risk. And some of you may not think it could be a risk. So I'm going to go ahead and start to close the poll. So you got a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to close that one and I'll share the results. Hopefully you guys can see those. But yeah, a majority of us, 9 of the 13 who responded said it was a high risk. 4 people said extreme risk. I would definitely put that in the high risk category. And we do a lot of training and a lot of things to make sure that that doesn't happen. But yeah, I would definitely agree with your all's assessment of that one. Let's just do one more and then we'll move on. I like polls. I've been told people like polls. Maybe if I can figure out how to do it. No technology. All right, here we go. There we go. All right, how are we going to rate a volunteer stealing sensitive information such as a social security number? I think a lot of us can relate to this one. We get a lot of sensitive information from our clients. Okay, we're getting a lot of extreme risks, a lot of high risk. 1 low risk, good. I'm hoping that's from experience and that it doesn't happen often. I don't know of a case in our programs personally where that's happened, so that's good. We're having those safeguards in place. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. We've had a majority of people. Good. Okay, so I think we're all in the right mindset of kind of how to assess those risks and just a couple of different examples. So thank you all for participating in that. So how to control the risks. Many of us have worked with volunteers for a while, or those programs that have been involved in the volunteer component from the start, and have assessed these risks in some fashion and ultimately determined that volunteering is worth the risk. The reward is way better than any risk that could happen. So maybe after we talk about everything, you decide to take a deeper dive into the roles and see if there are any ways to control the risk more. So a lot of the policies and things is what I'm referring to that we're going to talk about. The screening process is something we're going to dive into. And that's really our first line of defense in terms of mediating or mitigating any kind of volunteer risk that we have. So there are 2 ways that we can really control the risk, and that's either modifying the duties of the volunteer role or modifying the volunteer requirements to volunteer for a certain position. So to modify the duties, let's say there starts to be reports of a client not receiving a meal. Maybe we are able to implement a check-in policy that needs to be considered for volunteers to report that a meal has been delivered and when. So not to get too high tech, but let's get, Amazon, you have to, or any postal service really, you have to check and scan and make sure that that was delivered and when, that kind of a check-in system, maybe not as high tech, but some important check-in system. Or to modify volunteer requirements, maybe a more intensive background check is needed, maybe even fingerprinting for roles that work with sensitive client information. So there's different ways to control that risk. And the last part is to really review those controls. So it's always a good idea to review at least a minimum of an annual basis. And again, make sure you get all the input from supervisors, directors, legal teams, board of directors, and even the volunteers. It's a good way to get your volunteers involved. They are the front line, so they know possibly a little bit more of the risks that we may not have thought of. So they can see the concerns, and maybe, again, they have things that they see that we haven't thought of yet that we may need to include in some of our risk management. So get the volunteers involved. It's a good way to keep them engaged. Our volunteers want to be protected too and know what to do if something happens when they perform their duties. So I think this is a really good way to get the volunteer input in reviewing these controls. You also want to review when something happens. So COVID-19 is a great example. Maybe we didn't have a policy for if someone was sick, or our policy for when a volunteer isn't feeling well was a little bit like, we don't want you to show up if you're not feeling well, but now we've made it more detailed in if you have 101 temperature or whatever that temperature is, or you have to get temperature checked, or you have to wear a mask. So reviewing those controls and updating anything when something happens is a good way to review as well. So laws and insurance. So I'm going to preface this slide big time by saying that I am not an expert in law, and I don't know all that much about insurance. So if you have questions about the laws that we're going to talk about, or the law, I should say, that we're going to talk about, or any type of insurance that you should buy, I'm not going to know your answers. I can give you the suggestions of what the research has said, but you really need to talk to a legal professional to get the advice of what type of insurance and things that you need. So again, extremely important to talk to your governing bodies about this. But I do want to make you aware of a few things that are out there that you may not know about, or things that you may want to consider. So the first one is the Volunteer Protection Act of 1997. So a very broad, basic overview. I'm going to give you the 100,000-foot view on this guy. Is it limits the liability of volunteers for negligent acts or omissions committed while acting in the scope of their duties. And again, where are volunteers going to find the scope of their duties? In that volunteer role description. So another example, of course, of why those are so important. So while the basics of the law sound good, right? That's a pretty blanket statement. There are exceptions to the law, such as willful or criminal misconduct, gross negligence, reckless misconduct, and volunteers being under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Again, while having the law in place is a great step for volunteerism, it can't be our only line of defense. And it will not stop someone from filing a claim against a volunteer, our programs, or our organization. So we do have a little bit of a kind of a safety blanket, but it's by no means going to prevent something from happening, or a case to be possibly brought against. At the end of the day, we and our organizations are responsible for the actions of our volunteers. This is why this is probably one of the more important webinars, and I know a lot of people had to miss today for some other reasons, but I'm hoping a lot of people who missed the live presentation will watch this recording. And we're going to get more in depth on the good practices here in a little bit, I promise. It's also important to review the insurance policies of your organization or your programs. Some of your programs may have coverage through your organization. Some programs may have individual insurance. I'm not sure how your program is structured, but look at both if you have both. Typically, an agency's commercial general liability insurance includes coverage for alleged actions and damages of volunteers, but make sure that it does. Make sure you, if you can, get a copy of it and maybe highlight that section just so you kind of have that for your record. If you have a volunteer who's driving as part of your duties, so we have, volunteer drivers for My Ride, we have people who drive for meals, we have people who drive to events like health fairs for us. Make sure all volunteers, and verify this, that they have current and up-to-date auto insurance and a valid driver's license. You may not need, some programs may require copies of that information. Others, you just want to check in. Kind of depends on how formal your process is going to be. Your agency also may have commercial auto insurance that provides access coverage for volunteers using their own vehicles. This can sometimes be known as hired or non-owned coverage on the auto insurance, something you may want to look into to see if your agency has that. Something that we may not have that we may want to consider is volunteer accident policy insurance to provide medical coverage above and beyond volunteers' own healthcare coverage if a volunteer is hurt while performing their duties. That one's a big one you have to talk to your legal team about. Again, just to reiterate, I'm not an expert on the law or the insurance policies that you have. This is extremely important to get your legal counsel in on. Again, just suggestions. I cannot require you to do any of these things, but just things to consider. You can tell I'm really trying to cover my own self with this presentation. All right, let's talk about our screening process. So we are going to look at the 5 big components of our screening process. Most of us have these. elements. Some of us may not and want to include them in our screening process. So the first one, big one, is your volunteer application. We got our background screening, conflict of interest, confidentiality, and our code of ethics. Those are the big 5 ones that we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth. Feel free, as you have questions or comments, put them in the chat box. I have everyone on mute, so I do want everyone to kind of be engaged in the conversation. If you have anything, please feel free to type those in. So after our August webinar, we had a request from one of our attendees to kind of collect examples of volunteer applications. So we have a few examples for reference. I did send that out in August, and I will include that again in the follow-up email for this webinar. So there's a lot of things that are encouraged to be added to a volunteer application. It's going to be up to you, your program staff, supervisors, all those good individuals, to see what you want to include. So as you can see, there's a whole big list, and this is a good chunk of the list that I've found throughout multiple sources, but there could be even more suggestions. So I'm not going to read them all to you, but a few examples of things you may want to include is in addition to your name, maybe asking the name they prefer to be called. So my name is Sydney, but if I prefer to be called Sid, or maybe go by my middle name, you know, you want to know that so you know how to address your volunteers. Preferred method of contact, you know, you're going to ask them for their phone number, their email address, but do they like to get email? Do they check their email? Are they giving you an email that they never look at? Or do they prefer to be called? Do they prefer text? Kind of getting that information is good to have on hand if you really need to get in touch with someone. We're going to talk about background checks next. But it's my opinion every volunteer should be subject to at least a basic background screening. Does having a background check necessarily mean you have to have a volunteer social security number? Not necessarily. There are some free sites out there that we're going to talk about. But let's say a volunteer only wants to do admin work, like stuffing those envelopes, maybe doing a little bit of filing. So you may not have to do as in-depth of a background check, but maybe they want to increase or advance through your volunteer programs. And now they want to do something limited, but maybe in a few months or a year, they want to work more one-on-one with clients. Instead of having to go back and ask them for their social security number so you can do that more in-depth background check, it may be easier just to kind of get that information on the front end. We talked a few months ago about things that we should be tracking in our volunteer programs. So including race, ethnicity, and gender is something to track and put on that volunteer application. That is sensitive information, and some people may or may not want to disclose that. So having kind of a disclaimer of sorts, maybe something like, this information is not mandatory. However, our funding source requires us to recruit and retain a diverse group of volunteers. This information helps us complete reporting requirements. So letting them know that, you know, we're really just trying to show the impact of our program. It's not going to be counted for or against you, depending on what you answer. And that is an example that will be in the volunteer application. A good comment just came in the chat box, and I agree, and I meant to mention that, so thank you, Rebecca. So you should always inform your volunteers before running a background check, especially if they've given consent a while ago. So I know in particular for one of our programs, it's required to redo those background checks every 5 years. So I agree 100% with Rebecca that before you do that background check, letting the volunteers know, hey, the annual checks are coming around. Just want to let you all know you've signed this consent, but it's happening again, and putting those safeguards in place. Absolutely great suggestion, Rebecca. Similar statement. Oh, there it was for the background check. See, I did have it in my notes somewhere. It was a very good segment. Driver's license numbers or even copies of the auto insurance like we talked about a little while ago, if driving is part of their volunteer duty. And there's some of these areas that are listed on your screen that I've found volunteers complete more of the areas of the application if they have checkboxes instead of like an open answer section. So like education level, you may put, you know, high school, undergrad, master's, doctorate, whatever, and kind of give them their own check options, skills, availability, things like that. So they just kind of have to check a box instead of trying to freehand all their availability. And maybe instead of asking for a work history or a volunteer history, you ask volunteers to attach a copy of their resume. So that should have kind of employer records on there too, if that's something that you want to have for your screening of the application. Background checks. So there is a debate going on across nonprofit and public sectors about background checks. So no matter which side of the debate you're on, some people say background checks should be required. Other nonprofits say background checks are not needed. I think it also depends on what you're doing in terms of your mission and the services that you're providing. So if it's maybe an advocacy organization, maybe background checks aren't as needed if you're doing services, especially I know if services are being provided for minors or individuals under 18, there's definitely a lot of background check requirements going on. So no matter what side of the debate you're on, if you're a program associated with the Tennessee Commission on Aging and Disability, the minimum standard that we require, or we recommend, I shouldn't say require, look at your contracts if it's a requirement. I can't confirm that it's a requirement, but we definitely recommend, highly recommend, a minimum background check standard of the 4 free screening sites that you see on your screen, and I've included the links as well so you can get to them. But it's the Adult Abuse Registry, Sex Offender Registry, Felony Registry, and Drug Offender Registry. During the pandemic, we received almost 850 volunteer submissions through our website to help with multiple programs across the state. And through the help of 4 of my amazing coworkers, we were able to complete these 4 free screenings for each individual volunteer that came through our website. So as the volunteers were requested by agencies, not only were we able to give them the contact information for that volunteer, but I was also able to include all of the screenings to hopefully take a little bit of that work off of the coordinator that is working with these new volunteers. Now, your agency, or even maybe your grant requirements, depending on what you're working on, what their requirements are is the top standard. That's what you have to go with. So this is like a basic recommendation, but if your agency requires a paid background check or a screening through a service that you have to pay for, absolutely, you have to do that. No ifs, ands, or buts. Same thing goes if your grant requires volunteers to be fingerprinted or have a more thorough background check. Always look at what your grant and your program specify. And again, this is the minimum standard. You also have to think about what happens if something comes up on one of these registries. So do you have a policy in place if something comes back like there was a DUI on a driving record from when the individual was 25 and now they're 64? Is that going to eliminate them from being a volunteer? And that may be something that you guys determine on a case-by-case basis, but other things, maybe if they've ever been accused or reported of adult abuse or fraud, that may be considered zero tolerance, and no, that person may not be able to volunteer for a program because they came up on one of these searches. Different volunteer roles may also require different background check levels. So like kind of like what we talked about before, if they're just stuffing an envelope, do they need to go through the fingerprinting? Most likely not. Maybe this basic recommendation is all that's needed for someone who wants to do light admin work. But also, if they're doing mailing and filing, look at what information that they're filing. Does the information they're filing have the client's social security number on it or other sensitive information? If it does, maybe they need a little more thorough background check. Again, talk about this with your legal professionals, your supervisors, and even get the volunteers involved and get some of their input on it as well. Conflict of interest. So these policies will help safeguard, yet again, the reputation and integrity of our program. That's where the conflict of interest really comes in. So really, the conflict of interest plays a part when a volunteer is in a position to influence a decision that may result in personal gain for themselves or for a relative as a result of volunteering. So the best example that we have, and I actually have it up on the screen for you, is through our Tennessee SHIP SMP program, or State Health Insurance Assistance Program for SHIP, and SMT is Senior Medicare Patrol. I like to use acronyms. I'm trying to make sure everyone knows what those acronyms mean. So with that program in particular, they do not allow anyone who is licensed to sell insurance to be volunteers for the program, because that's really a direct violation against conflict of interest. SHIP SMT is a free, non-biased Medicare counseling service, so that automatically excludes agents because, well, it really eliminates the risk that an agent could be biased to the companies that they may be selling insurance for and going against that non-biased mission of the program. So again, here's an example. It's a rather long example. We are going to reference the Tennessee SHIP SMP program quite a lot in this presentation because they have a lot of great information. Not to bombard everyone with just one program's information, it's just kind of what we had at my resources at my disposal. So you may not have had time to review the policy. I'm not going to read it to everybody, but it is in your email that I sent you for this presentation, and I'll send it again in the follow-up as well. Confidentiality agreement. It's critical to all of our programs that we keep information about the people that we serve confidential, even from the tiniest detail. So we as volunteer coordinators also, oh, sorry, I'm doing normal. Oh, no, I'm not. Responsibility to keep confidential our volunteer information as well. So the conflict of interest and confidentiality kind of go both ways. So we need to protect our clients' information as well as that volunteer information. This policy creates an understanding between the volunteer and the program that they're not to disclose any personal or private information about the clients unless it's to an approved staff member to help resolve any issues. So of course, you know, if we're working with volunteers and they have a client who's been a victim of elder abuse or that's really struggling with a certain issue, when a volunteer comes to us, we do need that information. We may need, you know, their social security number to look them up in certain databases that we have access to. It's not saying that the volunteer can't disclose that information to us. That's why we really need in the policy to have that they can talk to approved personnel or however you want to word that, so we can help resolve those issues. But they shouldn't be discussing it outside of official business. They shouldn't be discussing it with their spouse or their kids or their friends or anything like that. So this is an example on your screen of a confidentiality agreement that we created for the Care Through Conversation telephone reassurance program that we developed as a result of COVID to help individuals who are feeling isolated, whether they be older adults or caregivers, no age requirement or anything like that, but anyone who just needs a weekly call to get check-ins or have that kind of companion relationship. Why the program was created, and it's been a success so far. So again, you have this information. We're not going to read it to you. If you haven't had a chance to read it, you have it in some of your materials from the emails. Code of ethics. So a code of ethics has a lot of parts to it. It can go anywhere from your policies on diversity and inclusion to volunteer and paid staff relationships, and kind of all across the board. Since there's a lot of categories to this code, many programs include this in their volunteer handbooks, which we're going to discuss shortly. They may have a short statement like the one that you see on the screen here, and then go into a lot more detail on specific categories kind of throughout the rest of the handbook, so it's kind of less overwhelming. And like I said, we're going to discuss a lot more of those individual code of ethic options or categories here shortly. So hopefully I'm doing better at giving the examples of things that I'm talking about. Fingers crossed. So there's a few must-have policies that we're going to discuss. And again, all of my sources I'm hoping I've put at the bottom. So if you all are interested on where I'm getting my information, you kind of have the source. and even more information and resource for your program. So the first one, take another drink through your water. Your volunteer role descriptions, job descriptions, position descriptions, however you want to say them. I never really thought of the role descriptions as a policy. I've seen it more as kind of a founding document of our programs. But essentially, it is a policy of what is to be expected of a role. So continuing to reinforce, again, how important the volunteer role description is, basically in every topic that we talk about. So a must-have policy is also a screening policy. We just discussed those 5 components. So it's good to know that we're on the right track when it comes to the must-have. Feedback and evaluation policy. So just like our jobs, we have performance reviews with our supervisor or directors or whoever does our performance. Some have a formal in-person meeting, others not as formal. So maybe done with just regular check-ins, email updates, or maybe a scheduled phone call. It doesn't have to be super formal. But it's important that the volunteer knows that feedback is going to be part of helping ensure that they have a rewarding experience with our program. And we also need to have a policy for volunteers to feel comfortable giving us as staff and program management feedback on how we're doing. Hopefully it's constructive and not just, you're doing a terrible job. But next month, we're really going to dive more into this and focus on program evaluation and how to get volunteer feedback. So I do try and give my cliffhangers every month on, keeping you coming back for more. So I'm hoping that was a good one. And you'll join me next month for that webinar on some feedback and program evals. Dismissal policies. Last month, we talked very in-depth on volunteer removal and can we fire a volunteer? The short answer is yes. However, dismissal from our volunteer programs should be the last resort and never the first option. If you weren't with us last month, please go back to the YouTube channel and check that webinar out. A lot of really good detailed information on the alternatives to removal. And in the rare occasions that we may have to remove a volunteer for our program, there's some good tips and tricks on kind of how to do that. But if we do have to dismiss, it's good to have a policy set in place for those expectations for that volunteer. And it's also a great way to set parameters and boundaries for what is not acceptable as a volunteer who represents our programs and agencies in the community. And we're going to also look, again, at an example of that here shortly. Privacy and personal information policy. We talked about the confidentiality agreement and how a volunteer needs to make sure that they don't share sensitive information about the people that we serve. But again, maybe this one goes more into we have to protect that volunteer information as well. So like we mentioned when we looked at the different options for the volunteer application, we may ask for social security numbers. That's highly sensitive information. So we need to let the volunteers know and be transparent and say why we need certain things, like the social security number, for example. We need this to perform your background check or whatever it may be. And how we're going to store this information to protect them. So once you complete your application, it will be filed, or it will be kept in a locked filing cabinet where only 2 staff people, the program coordinator and the program volunteer coordinator, have access. You can be as detailed as you want. The more detailed, the better for transparency. Again, talk with your staff and supervisors on how you want to word those things. Accessibility policy. Many of our programs work closely with individuals with disabilities and encourage inclusion in our volunteer recruitment. While we may not be able to accommodate every need, because there's some very specific needs that are required, we need to acknowledge that we're going to do our best and everything in our power to accommodate the needs of every volunteer to allow them to be successful in their roles. So setting the expectation that we're going to do everything that we can, we're going to ask you what you need, but we're going to be upfront and let you know that if we may not have X, Y, Z that's needed, but we're looking into how to get that for a volunteer. And the last must-have policy is a workplace violence and harassment policy. So our agencies have workplace violence and harassment policies in place that may already include volunteers, or it may kind of be an umbrella that says anyone who is in our office during operating hours or something along those lines. However, if they don't have kind of an umbrella statement like that, or they don't include volunteers, I would ask you all to advocate having volunteers be put in that policy, because they are, especially if they do work in your office on a regular basis, they need to be included in all of that. This is most likely going to be a zero tolerance policy in grounds for removal after an investigation. But as we review our policies, we do need to include the process of how to report any violence or harassment. So who does the volunteer going to report it to? Are they going to report it to you? I know this will never happen, but again, we're talking about kind of any case scenario. If the volunteer coordinator is the one who's doing the harassment, who would the volunteer report it to? Or is there multiple layers of reporting? Is there a form to fill out? Do they have to have written documentation, or does it just need to be verbal documentation? And is there any kind of way that the volunteer can remain anonymous to prevent any type of possible retaliation from the person that they're reporting? So things like that to consider. If you already have them in place, ways to talk to whoever creates your policies, maybe it's an HR person, human resources, to make sure volunteers can kind of be incorporated in that as well. So there's a lot of other policies to consider. So you can see my sources at the bottom. These are just a few more examples. And again, we're going to get to some examples in the handbook here shortly. But the volunteer roles and responsibilities, this is really to set expectations. You know, volunteers have the right to have a safe work environment, to have respect from staff and other volunteers, and to be able to resign at any time. There's some rights. There's a lot more rights. Those are just a couple. And kind of the flip side of that, volunteers also have the responsibility to ensure that the rights are upheld for other staff and volunteers as well. So whatever their rights are, it's also their responsibility to make sure that those rights are respected amongst everyone, not just for them. Record management, volunteer reporting is a struggle for everyone. Unless, I don't know if anyone has not had any issues with volunteers reporting data. If you have no issues and your volunteers are reporting data regularly, I would love for you to do a presentation to all of us and tell us what magic you use in getting volunteers to report regularly. I would love for you to present and teach me a few things. But having a policy that details what is to be reported and when it's to be reported, and also how to keep the records safe and secure is something that you might want to put in your records management. Dress code, it sounds silly. You may not think that this should be a requirement or even need to be stated. And I know a lot of our volunteer roles don't, expect volunteers to be business professional dressed or anything of that nature, but having a short policy is a good idea just to prevent any type of inappropriate attire. Attendance and time, our volunteer role descriptions, take another drink, already addresses the time commitment and volunteer service, but we may want to reiterate that. The more they see it, the more they hear it, the more they're going to remember it, and the more they know it's important. A good example is if you have a board of directors, this may be really important to add to the requirement. I know many boards say you have to attend over 50% of your meetings every year, or you're at risk of being asked to leave the board. You have to have attendance. If you have 4 meetings, you need to attend at least 2, maybe a requirement of 3. But setting that standard is really important. Changing the placement, we addressed this last month as well, but giving the volunteer the expectation that upon a review, a volunteer may not seem fit to the role that they've chosen for whatever documented reasons that you have. The volunteer or even the coordinator may look at changing the volunteer role and placement for better success. So we had another comment come in, and I agree with this as well. During orientation, it's fun to mention the dress code. It saves you from having to have that awkward conversation later. So yeah, setting that expectation early and even often is a really good idea. I agree. Leave of absence. So many times we don't know we'll be away for an extended period of time. Maybe there's a family emergency, a personal emergency, or the volunteer just needs to take a break. Again, with the SHIP SMP program, we've talked about this before. A lot of our volunteers with that program, we don't see them for a few months after Medicare's open enrollment period that started yesterday. So they're going to see a huge surge in volunteers that are going to help regularly, and then they may not hear from those volunteers for 2 or 3 months because they just need a break. But it's good to have a policy that if the volunteer knows, you know, I go to Florida for 3 months in the winter, just kind of having, not necessarily having it a requirement, but a little policy that says if you know you're going to be away for an extended period of time, that the volunteer can let the volunteer coordinator know, especially if they're a volunteer that you rely on heavily. But again, you may not know something's happening. This also is a policy that applies to you all, and me, myself included. If you know you're going to be away for an extended period of time, letting the volunteer know you're going to be gone, giving them an alternative contact while you're gone, so they know who they can contact in your absence. Training, detailing any initial orientation, initial update training requirements is important. It's important that volunteers know that they will be recognized, not necessarily in every single little detail, but letting them know that it's either going to be, you know, verbally, written, maybe there's an event every year. While it's generally not at the top of the volunteers' priority list, a lot of volunteers don't volunteer to be recognized. We want to recognize them. Again, it's that impact that we talked about a few months ago, but it's also, it's really good to let them know on the front end that they are going to be appreciated. And then we have to uphold that policy that we've set in place. Smoking, I mean, there are volunteers, let them know where the designated smoking areas are. Especially if they're working at your building, maybe if they're at a senior center, tell them, you know, if they're volunteering off location or off away from the office, to ask where the designated smoking areas are wherever they're volunteering at. Same thing, well, not really same thing, but drugs and alcohol, probably again, this is going to be zero tolerance, but setting that expectation that volunteers are strictly forbidden from volunteering under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Some of our programs may have the ability to reimburse volunteer expenses, depending on your budget. Not all of us have that capability, but for those of us who do, letting them know what the procedure is going to be, if there's a form, when the deadline is to submit information for reimbursement, how often they can get reimbursed. Maybe it's every month. You have to turn in your report by the 15th, and then we'll issue your reimbursement by the 31st or the last day of the month, whatever your policy is. Let them know. And then equipment, the last one there. Again, this may not apply to all of our programs, but for the programs that can provide equipment to help volunteers in their role, it's important to have a policy and letting the volunteer know what happens if the equipment is damaged, lost, or stolen. The volunteer have to pay to replace that. It depends on the situation. Going over those policies as well. I'm sure there are way more policies than the ones that we've just gone over. So let me know in the chat box if there's any policies that you see that I may have missed, any ones that you think are important for us to know. I'm just curious on what I've missed in the research. I'm sure there's so much research. I'm sure that I've missed a few things. So volunteer handbook. We've talked about over 20 recommended policies to have for our program. I don't know about you, but I don't want to sign 20 pieces of paper saying that I understand each individual policy. Volunteers definitely don't want to do that. A volunteer handbook is a great one-stop shop to house all of our policies and procedures for our program. Think of it kind of like our employee handbooks that we get at work. We sign it upon employment, and we have to review it every so often and tell our employers that we understand and agree with all of the terms and kind of terms and conditions, probably not the right way to say that, but the details that are inside. Handbooks are a great way to help recruit volunteers. They serve as a self-screening tool for prospective volunteers. Great, as Rebecca mentioned, for orientation, all that out there and on the front end, and communicate the organization's program culture, and the standard practices. So I don't know about you all, but especially during this pandemic, we've been encouraged to move more and more to an electronic document system, but not so much paper copies of materials. Personally, I'm a fan of a paper trail, but that's because technology and I are working on repairing our relationship because it's been a little strained lately. But if we've learned nothing else from this, from COVID, is that we aren't really going to possibly, depending on situations, of course, we may not have as much access to our offices for those paper files as we did in the past. So we need more electronic stuff. So in terms of our volunteers having access to our program materials, I think we need to do more of a hybrid model of paper and electronic versions of our handbooks, our applications, our policies, and any other component of risk management that we've talked about. So remember, not all volunteers are comfortable with technology. So we don't want to lose potentially good volunteers for not having an accessible method to begin the volunteer process. So it's good to have your application online. It's good to have your handbook online so volunteers can see all that stuff. If you're able to do applications kind of in a form that the application will be sent to you, the volunteer can fill it out right online instead of just having kind of a PDF copy of your application available. I think that's a really good way to go. It'll maybe get you some more volunteers because of that ease of access to that application. We need to be sure to review and update our handbooks regularly, if we have one. Maybe you don't have one, maybe after this presentation and we look at an example, you may want to implement one. Annually is typically recommended, just like with our risk management, all other risk management things. But also when something comes up, we need to update the handbook throughout the year. Again, COVID is a great example of this. Many of us have had to update wearing our masks, disinfecting procedures, temperature checks, and so much more. Having a policy in one document, like a handbook, for example, again, not required, but it's a really good way to do it, in my opinion. It's going to make updating things so much easier for us. You also have to consider, do volunteers need to sign the handbook every so often? Do they just need to sign it when they first start volunteering? If a new policy is included, do they need to re-sign it again and again if something's updated? It depends on how important that policy is and making sure that all your volunteers understand it. Now, if it's something general, maybe you're updating your staff tree with client or with contact information, probably don't need to sign it. Again, volunteers don't need to re-sign it, but volunteers, after every little change, volunteers need to be sure to have the most up-to-date version of that volunteer handbook. Again, that's why it's really important that not only, we can email it all day long for that updated version, or we can have the most up-to-date version on our website. And that way, if a volunteer, doesn't like getting so many emails from you or having to save attachments on their personal computers, hey, if you ever need anything, go to this link on the site. Here you can access your volunteer handbook, and there's been updates on pages 10, 15, and 17, or whatever it might be. So now we are going to look at a volunteer handbook example, and this is also included in your initial email, and I'm going to include it again in the follow-up. So we're going to look at the handbook for the Tennessee SHIP SMP program. And again, SHIP stands for State Health Insurance Assistance Program, and SMP is Senior Medicare Patrol. So I have to give a huge thank you to Ryan, Alenka, Lori, and Lonnie, who are the state staff for these programs and allowed me to show this and share, not only show you the handbook, but also share, and everyone's going to have a copy of this handbook with you. The handbook was created because of grant requirements from the program's founders. SMP actually created, they called their handbook the Volunteer Risk and Program Management Handbook, again, required by the grant. We did have one comment come in. Don't forget, not all volunteers are tech wizards or even have emails. Absolutely. That's why we want to make sure we have paper copies of everything as well as electronic. Definitely a great point. So SMP actually created the first version. We call it the VRPM, just for short. And because SHIP and SMP programs in Tennessee work so strongly together, when it came time for SHIP to implement one, we were able to use the foundation that SMP established and create a detailed, comprehensive handbook. I will let you know, I do know quite a bit of background about this because I worked with SHIP, I worked with Lonnie, and we created this mamma jamma that we're going to look at, about 36 pages, I think. But the reason why it's so long is there was almost 150 policies that were given to us by our grant funders that were either required or recommended. So assuming eventually all the policies were going to be required, we just included everything. So take a look at the handbook. Now I'm not going to read it to you. Again, you have copies of it, we're all adults. But, you can see it was last updated in August, most likely for COVID updates. They have a welcome and a thank you, so that's an important component that we didn't talk about initially in the presentation, thanking the volunteers for what they do. If you have a funder and they want to include a thank you, that's a good idea, not only from the program staff, but also who you're getting the money from. Histories of your program or programs is good. If you have partnerships that are really important, community partnerships, add a little bit of detail on those partnerships. A table of contents, so it's easier for volunteers to kind of get to certain things. It doesn't have to be super detailed, but here's some examples of a table of contents. I'm hoping everyone can see the PDF. They should be able to. If you can't, let me know. An organizational structure, so kind of like our organizational tree, so to speak. So you have kind of the state staff down to your regional staff, and then of course all your volunteers. At the bottom, not there. I say at the bottom loosely because we all know volunteers are a vital part of the program. It's not that they're the low men on the totem pole, but just kind of hierarchy, I guess. Directories, so all your contact information. You have your state staff up here with their email addresses and phone numbers, fax information. And then particularly with the SHIP SMP program, they're broken down by region. So they have all the regional information. So live by this. So an introduction of why this book has been created is always a good thing. Role, classifications, and descriptions. So the one thing that the handbook doesn't have is a copy of the volunteer role description that can be added maybe as appendix with a suggestion, but there is kind of an outline or an overview of all 5 of the volunteer roles that the SHIP SMP program has. So while it may not be the exact volunteer role description, it does indicate an overview, and then I believe somewhere it also says if they want a copy that the regional staff has copies that they can give the volunteers. Here's your rights and responsibilities. We talked about that policy. So at the top, you have your rights, and then the responsibilities, I believe, go into the next page. Yep, all in bullet points. I like bullet points. A lot more people read bullet points than big paragraphs. A representation policy. So volunteers do, we talked that they are kind of the face of the program when they're out in the community. So what if a volunteer is asked to do a TV interview? We may not want them to do that. You should not, however, hold yourself as a public spokesperson for the program in connection with media inquiries or questions related to official policy positions. That's a solid statement. Remaining non-biased, that's a big component of the SHIP SMP program. There's our dress code. Yeah, again, not super long. Orientation and training, so there's their training policies for the different levels of training. Volunteer and paid staff relationships, volunteers from another state. So SHIP SMP is a nationwide program. However, it's called different things in different states, and there's different requirements for different programs. So this is kind of a policy that if we have someone who comes over from Ohio and they want to volunteer for Tennessee SHIP SMP program, they may have to go through certain requirements before they're allowed to volunteer. There's different standards. Screening procedure, there's good policy. Application, the background checks, here's your conflict of interest. I believe that was the example I used in the slide presentation. Here's your code of ethics. Protecting confidentiality, so here's your confidentiality statement and agreement. Again, it can continue to be shared. Computer safety, that's a good one that I don't think we necessarily mentioned in the presentation. Keeping clients' information safe, securing computer and paper records, policy. The internet, reporting stolen and lost customer information. Your safety, so again, the safe service environment, and the volunteers on duty. Home visits, that's a big thing. I know a lot of our programs, we may meet individuals, our clients in the home. There's a specific home visit policy to make sure that nothing happens. Violence, we talked about that, violence and harassment. A disaster plan. I mean, we just had a tornado in Nashville, Cookeville, Chattanooga. There are a lot of places. So making sure that the volunteers know to communicate wherever they're at of their disaster plan if something happens. In illness or injury, this is where I think the most up-to-date updates, that's a terrible way to put that, came into play. But you can see, you know, temperature of 100 degrees or more is when they should stay home, dry hacking, all that good stuff. I'm not going to say everything, but having specific things specified that the volunteer knows, okay, I'm having some issues, maybe I shouldn't volunteer. Substance abuse, smoking, harassment, you mentioned those in the slideshow. Weapons, prohibited weapons, tools and equipment, media, falls, carrying things, office equipment. This goes into the code of conduct stuff, so all those different categories. Accidents, insurance requirements. So this a lot of the volunteers drive to and from health fairs or counseling appointments and things of that nature. Volunteer separation, we have a resignation, a policy that volunteers can resign at any time. Also discipline and dismissal. So is the volunteer removal portion. Immediate dismissal and suspension. Excellent. Exit interviews. Perfect. Performance management. So this goes into how coordinator is going to give you support. The performance evaluation, any corrective actions that need to happen. It details all that information. Recognition, there you go. How volunteers are going to be recognized. Incident reporting, we talked about how volunteers are going to report any kind of harassment or anything of that nature. So emergency contact procedures, reporting incidents, reporting conflicts of interest. And then for anything, a volunteer has grievance and appeals procedures. So if we tell the volunteer, you know, we have to let you go, there's a procedure that the volunteer can appeal that and try and stay with the program. We use a lot of acronyms, like I mentioned. So here's kind of a dictionary of all the acronyms and definitions of what's used. Created an incident report form. Now, most places that people are volunteering at, whether it be a senior center or offices or wherever, if something happens, the agency is going to have a form that the volunteer or the client has to fill out. That overrules any of this reporting form. If you have something from an agency, you don't have to do multiple forms that say the same thing. Whatever form is done, we just need documentation of the incident. There's 2 pages. Of in-kind and volunteer service. And then finally, the volunteer agreement. So on this page in particular, they have to initial things that they understand, driver's license, the training, read the code of conduct, read the conflict of interest, nature, I believe confidentiality is in there somewhere. Here we go, confidential information. So they have to initial that they've recognized all of these individual things that has been detailed throughout the handbook, and then they have to sign it. And so does the volunteer coordinator have to sign it. And it's relatively long, but it's detailed. So the expectations in those boundaries are safe. And to my knowledge, someone correct me if I'm wrong, there's been no instances where volunteers have stolen information or had any kind of misconduct that resulted in a volunteer being asked to leave the program. Let's see, My Ride West Tennessee, for any form that the volunteer signs as a separate piece of paper from the handbook, and the volunteer is given a copy. Perfect. Like I said, a handbook is a good thing to have, and it's not a requirement. We may not have as many policies and procedures that were required for these programs. But could you imagine having to sign each individual policy that was required by this program? Our volunteers would have left rather quickly. All right, so a few key takeaways. Remember that volunteer risk management process when you're working with your policies and procedures. So identify, assess, control, and review. That rating system, low, moderate, high, and extreme, kind of those examples that we took the polls of. That was kind of an aha moment for me. I was like, oh, I never really thought about kind of ranking anything. So I think I'm going to go back and look at that myself. Take a deep look at your screening process as well. You may want to update your application or add a few questions or reformat something to get a clearer picture of the skills that your volunteers have that you're looking for to better match them with roles. Do you need to add a layer of background check? Maybe you're just doing the basics, but maybe you need to look at eventually when the new budget cycle runs around, do I want to budget a little bit more money for paid background checks? Always keep that budget in mind. And you may not have the funding currently, but look to expand it as a budget line in future grant requests or funding requests. We talked about so many policies, probably don't remember all the ones that we discussed. And you may find some more valuable than others. By no means does it mean all 20 or even 150 that were outlined in the SHIP SMP VRPM, you don't need all of them. But hopefully there's been some good examples and some good language that you can adapt to cater to your volunteer program so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. That was kind of a big emphasis for this presentation, is if you don't have something, hopefully you're given the examples. Consider creating a volunteer handbook so everything's in one convenient place for your volunteers and you. Having everything in one place is much more efficient in a way of managing paperwork for your volunteer files as well. Something to consider. And that's going to be all for the volunteer risk management. So while I go over some updates and things, please feel free to type in any questions or comments that you have. And I'll go through these updates rather quickly. We got about 15 more minutes. So numbers continue to grow every month, and I can't thank all of you enough for everyone who continues to submit data. If you haven't submitted data for the 2020 volunteer campaign, I really encourage you to do it. Our goal was 2,020 volunteers. We have 3,000, and there are more growing every week, with over 86,600 hours of volunteer service to our program. And you can see I've kind of broken them down by programs that have reported the data. So Ombudsman, I have 3 regions of the Ombudsman. So if the other 6 regions want to report, I need to take out the 2 regions for the MyRide. I apologize. I have MyRide information from the program as a whole. So that is the whole MyRide transportation. My apologies. Nutrition, 3 regions. So if more nutrition providers want to submit data, senior centers, we have 23. I think we have like 110 senior centers across the state. So if more senior centers want to participate, that would be wonderful. And we have the SHIP SMP numbers because I have access to the database. I do want to give you all, or let you know that I do share this information on a weekly basis with my executive director, and then we also share this information with our commission members. So there is a commission member, at least 1 per region of the state, and our state's broken into 9 regions. So your regional representatives do get this data. If you want to include your program information, it's only going to help. I also wanted to share with you an update on the Make a Difference Monday campaign. So we did have some technical issues with our agency's Facebook page the last couple weeks this month. So thank you to everyone who's had patience and understanding. especially the 6 programs who submitted a form to highlight their volunteers. The dates have been adjusted, and we are back up and running. We posted this last Monday, so we're back on track. We're also adding the Make a Difference Monday post to our agency Twitter account, so we're going to try and do even more exposure. Our Twitter account is followed by a lot of elected officials and news outlets. Hopefully, we can spread the word even further on our amazing volunteers using that account. We're still looking for 6 more submissions to be able to say that we've highlighted a volunteer every Monday that our page is available for an entire year. So I know I'm going to do another push to my volunteers to see if they'll submit, and I hope you join me in doing the same. Amazing numbers. I'm super duper excited. As always, if you guys wouldn't mind to complete the webinar survey, whether you're listening live here with us today or you listen to it later on YouTube, please take a few minutes to complete the survey. I have reconstructed it. So it used to be kind of answer a question, go to the next page, answer a question, go to the next page. So I have made it be all on one page, and I've decreased some of the questions. So I think there's only 11 questions on it now. So hopefully that'll be easier for you all to complete. And we've gotten, 5 to 10 surveys a month. So I'm hoping that we can get more than that this month. I think we have at least 18 people who are listening live right now. So I'm hoping at least we get 18 responses. Our next webinar is going to be Friday, November 20th. I know now we're in November and December. We're getting closer to the holidays. I really hope that you all can continue to join us. I know it's going to be a tough, we talked kind of before the webinar, the fall is really a tough time, really busy time for everyone. So we may look at adjusting some of the webinars for the series next year. But please join us to take a deeper dive into that program evaluation and getting some volunteer feedback about the program. And always, thank you so much. And please fill out that survey. I love seeing your comments and suggestions of topics for next year's series. So please do those and any good news stories you have. Yeah, I'm going to hang out for a little bit and answer questions or have conversations, but I appreciate you all listening in, and we'll talk next month.